Testing.
Camera is rolling, and just hold the paper a little more towards me. There you go. Okay, and we're rolling, Isabel.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, you can put it down. Okay. Would you please introduce yourself, your date of birth and place of birth?
My name is Michael Fried. I was born on September 13, 1936, in the town of Volen, which is about 14 miles east of Warsaw.
In Poland.
In Poland, yes.
Okay, and your parents were in the same house. Can you describe your home? Do you remember your home?
Sure. My parents had a small bicycle and radio shop on the main street in Volen. We lived in back of the store. It basically had a living room and a kitchen, and we slept in the adjoining building, which was a 2-story brick building. We had a large garden in the back where I played with our neighbor's little daughter, Selinka, who was my best friend. Our parents were busy doing their job. Her father was a pharmacist in town, and so they were perfectly happy to let us run around and play. They didn't have to worry about that we'd be kidnapped by somebody. These were tranquil times, so it was very. Until the age of 3, it was very idyllic. My father's mother, my grandmother Rachel, lived with us, and she really spent a lot of time taking care of me. She was 90 years old. She had lived on a farm all her life and had 11 children, and my father was the baby of the family. He was born when she was almost 50, and I was the youngest grandchild, the youngest of 70.
Okay. Did you have siblings in the house?
No, I was the only child. My mother gave birth to a little girl named Hannah, but she died a week after she was born. She caught pneumonia and died, and my mother went to a real deep state of depression, and the doctor suggested that the best way to help bring her out was to have another child as quickly as possible, and so I was born about 10 months later.
Okay. All right. And did you go to school?
No, I was too young. So I actually didn't go to school till I was 11 when when we came to Paris.
Did you have a religious home?
Oh yes, my parents were they were modified Orthodox. They were quite religious, and they were reasonably Orthodox, but my parents would occasionally give me a ham sandwich and say, "Go eat outside so Grandma doesn't see you."
That's funny. Did the neighbors that you played with, this little girl, were they Jewish?
Yes. Volen had a fair number of Jews in town. For some reason, 2,000 sticks in my mind. It may be wrong, but it may be something I may have heard my parents say after the war. But there were a lot of Jews.
Was there a synagogue in the town?
Yes, there was a synagogue in town, and all of my parents' friends were Jewish. I have memories of their friends coming in the evening. They'd sit around, unlike in America, not drinking alcohol, but drinking endless glasses of teas and discussing stuff.
Card parties?
There were card parties. My father used to like to do card tricks. While he became very humorless as after the war, before the war, I have memories of him being a real charmer and doing card tricks. Yes, it was. They were living the kind of life that they'd only dreamed of. My mother growing up very poor in the town of Pultusk, and my father growing up on a farm. So this was their idea of what Americans refer to as a good life.
Can you give me your parents' names before I proceed?
Sure. My father's name was Srul Zalman, and my mother's name was Havalaya, and her maiden name was Brza, which is birch, translates into birch.
Okay. All right. When did things change?
Well, things changed when Germany invaded Poland, and the Polish prime minister told everybody, "Don't worry, with our allies, France and England, we will defeat them like we did in World War I." 35 days later, they had conquered Poland. Various parts of Poland were divided up. Russia got some, Lithuania got some, Slovenia got some parts, but we were in the German-occupied. And a few weeks after that, we were herded into the Volen ghetto. These were summer houses on the outskirts of town and poorly insulated. They surrounded it with barbed wire, and we were packed into there. We shared one house with 3 other families, and my maternal grandfather, Mendel Brza, who came to us, he had been, I'm not sure why he wanted to come see my mother, probably because she was sending him money before the war to help him survive. He got caught by the Germans. They beat him up and tied him to a tree in the middle of the Polish winter, which is very, very cold. And he was there tied that way for three days until some farmers found him, untied him, and brought him to us. But he was paralyzed from the waist down after that. So it was it was just sad to see him.
Do you remember going from your house to the ghetto, what you might have taken with you?
No, I don't. This was, I was 3 years old. This was my parents' job. Mm-hmm. And one of the wonderful things about being a 3-year-old is you don't have to worry about things. Your parents are there. They'll take care of things. And when I became a parent, I tried to remember that children ascribe magical powers to their parents. And as long as they're around, you don't worry, you feel safe. They'll take care of you.
Do you have memories of the place where you lived in the ghetto?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It was a 2-story wooden house. There was a kitchen, which, of course, everybody used. And we had one room on the ground floor where we slept. My grandfather was upstairs, as were also the other 2 families.
Do you know who the other two families were?
No, I really didn't interact with them much. There were a bunch of kids in the ghetto, and I would play with them. There was a clear separation between children and adults.
Okay. While you were in the ghetto, were there shortages of food? What were the conditions like?
Yeah. Well, there were always shortages of food, but a number of people became smugglers bringing in food, which was really dangerous because if you were a Jew caught outside of town, you would get shot. My mother was the only woman who got involved in smuggling, and this was in character for her. She had unlimited guts, could think on her feet better than anybody else. She loved the challenge, and she also had no problem bending the truth, which became part of her lifetime survivor skill. So while other people, when they got caught, got shot, she got caught several times, but always managed to wangle out of it. Well, first of all, she prided herself on speaking Polish, not with a Yiddish accent, but as an educated Pole. This was very important to her. So one time she was coming back with 200 pounds of wheat, grain, over her bicycle, and she was coming out of the woods, and she was coming towards the ghetto. And there were, we could see two German soldiers hiding in the bushes with two Polish boys. They didn't know who was a Jew and who wasn't, so they brought the two Polish boys with them, and the Polish boys only had to point and say Żyd. Now, you standard normal human being, when my mother spotted them, we saw them from the ghetto side, and everybody was already hugging me because I was going to be a poor orphan. But my mother saw them, and she quickly realized that she spoke both Polish and German. Germans only spoke German. The Polish kids only spoke Polish. So she yelled to the Polish boys and said, "Don't tell them who I am." And they answer in Polish, "We have to, or they'll beat us." So then she turns very indignant to the Germans. And in German, they said, "Why do you allow these filthy boys to say terrible things about you?" And so they started hitting the kids, and they ran away. And then my mother said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm staying with my aunt a couple of miles from here. She sent me out to get food for the pigs, and I think I've lost my way." And they said to her, "But this is the ghetto." And she said, "Oh, Jesus Maria, where the Christ killers are?" Spat on the ground and say, "Oh, I thank you for saving me. I hate seeing those people." And she got directions and went back into the woods and waited till the night. Germans were gone, and then she came back to the ghetto. And somebody else might have given up at that point, but she kept on doing this.
When she was gone,
We're rolling again.
thank you. When your mother was out doing these errands to get supplies, where was your father?
My father stayed in the house or went to philosophized with his friends. He had studied to be a rabbi. He was the youngest of the 11 children, born when my grandparents were 50 or so. And to my grandfather's despair, all of his previous sons were what he would call dumbbells. They were not scholar material. And my father showed that he was very bright right from the beginning. So that was a mistake he made, because at age 5, the spoiled baby of the family was sent to a yeshiva. Basically, it was, he went to study with a melamed with a bunch of other wunderkinds. They slept on the floor. They were really, the one good meal they had was dinner, which they got by people being charitable and inviting them for dinner. And he didn't see his family except on the high holidays. So he was about ready to become a rabbi when he was drafted in the Russian, by the Russians. And when he came out from there, he didn't want to be a rabbi anymore. And so my grandfather essentially threw him out of the house. So my father, while he had established a business, was not a brave person. And my mother always had center stage anyway. She didn't allow anybody to share the stage with her. So he just got used to letting her take the lead.
Interesting. Okay. So he was basically staying around the house or with his
Friends,
other
yeah.
Okay. Did he contribute in any way to everybody's survival under these conditions there?
No, it was all my mother's doing, which is why when I wrote the book about how we got through, I called it My Mother's War, because she's the one who did everything that allowed us to survive. And I don't know if at this stage you want me to tell you how we got out of the ghetto. Again, thanks to my mom. When we had railroad tracks going to Treblinka, which was built on my grandfather's farm, and we could see the cattle cars full of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto going to Treblinka. We heard rumors about what was happening there, but nobody knew, and nobody could believe that people would do something like that. But my mother knew that it was only a question of time till they'd liquidate our ghetto. We were just a holding pen. And we would wind up on those in those cattle cars to Treblinka. And they featured heavily in some of my nightmares as I was growing up. But when she was foraging for food, which she bought from the farmers around, she started very early in the game looking for somebody, someplace who could hatch. She knew if we stayed in the ghetto, we would not survive. And she found one, and she had to have several criteria, as she told me later on. The first one, finding somebody who'd be willing to risk keeping us for money. The second one, since there was no law to protect us, she had to find somebody who she believed would not just kill us and take our money. So she finally found this one family, the Pashniks, and a few days before the ghetto was liquidated, and she found out somehow she had contacts. My parents woke me up around 2 in the morning. I was 5 years old at the time. And I thought it was a great adventure. I mean, oh, we're going somewhere. It's great. But we packed everything we had in one valise. We got through the barbed wire, under the barbed wire, and in the middle of the night, we walked to the farmhouse where we hid out. Now, the thing that is easy was you have to get to be in your 80s to recognize that life isn't simply black and white. But as a teenager, I often wondered how my mother could do what she did. We had my grandfather living with us. She couldn't take him with us. And while she didn't love him, my grandfather, from what I hear, was the ultimate patriarch. She revered him. And to leave him behind is one of those situations that survivors really had to struggle with normal human beings do not have to. And how hard that had to be for her. But the people who survived are the ones who were single-minded and did the one thing, whatever it took, made choices, and the choices were always, how can I best survive? And so we left, and later, after the war, when we came back to the town, we found out from one of the policemen who was involved with the Germans in rounding up the people in the ghetto. My grandfather couldn't get down from upstairs. He told us that they dragged him by the heels down the stairs and shot him at the bottom of the stairs. And that's something that I know my mother had to live with, and must, in retrospect, have been very, very hard. It's those kind of things that eat at your soul. Now, would you like me to tell you about what happened once we got into...
can we go back, please, and just finish? What did you typically eat? Was there, in the ghetto? What was your day like in the ghetto as a child?
For me as a child, it was basically I just played with my friends. We had, my parents, unlike some people in the ghetto, had some money, so they could buy extra stuff. Plus my mother, through the smuggling, brought in more. But basically it was, we certainly had bread and potatoes, still my comfort foods. I remember having eggs and milk. Dinner usually was soup. But in the ghetto, while a lot of people had trouble, we did, because my parents had money and my mother smuggled, we did relatively well. So.
Did you see anybody getting sick in the ghetto? Was there any medical care available?
No, I don't remember anybody getting sick. I'm sure, I know there were a couple of Jewish doctors, so there must have been, if somebody got sick, there were doctors who take care of them. But and now this is a guess, so I can't guarantee. I doubt whether there was lots of medicine. That was something, since it was hard enough to get enough food.
And did you have any idea what was going on in the outside world?
Well, there were a couple of Jews who escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were on the way to join the partisans. And they stopped, and that is where we heard stories of what was happening to the people who were on the cattle cars going to Treblinka. It was, I sort of heard people talk about it, but I was a 5-year-old. Again, it was not my problem. This was my parents. But I remember discussions. Could that possibly be true? What would they do with us? How do we deal with this? But for most people in the ghetto, you were just, you were there feeling helpless. Only people like my mother, and there were few of her who said, helpless my eye, I'm gonna get through it. But there were activities in the ghetto. There was a small theater group. There was a Beit Din. I remember. There certainly was the synagogue. There was a school for the older kids. So in the 2 years that we were there, people sort of organized themselves as a society, trying to make life as normal as possible. But again, this is, I as a child just floated.
Okay. So after 2 years, you go to the farm.
Yeah.
And you can please describe that.
Okay. Now, the farm where we hid out in the root cellar, which was under the kitchen. It was basically had beaten earth on the ground. There were just 2 windows at the top, small windows that led out into the backyard. So that was where the little light that we got in. This is where they stored potatoes and turnips and the vegetables that they had in the back. Old abandoned furniture. It was, we slept on burlap bags filled with straw. And our diet there basically, now there it became very, very simple. We would get some bread in the morning. We got more bread and maybe a baked potato with occasionally a piece of fat back. And for dinner, the wife of the farmer would bring us some soup and more bread.
Describe to me, did the floor go up to get down to your...
There was a trap door in the kitchen.
Yes. And
that led to wooden stairs.
Right.
That led you into down into the cellar. And in fact, my father came up with a very ingenious way for us to hide in case Germans came into search the farmhouse, which in fact they did. There was from the trapdoor to the wall, there were about 5 feet or 6 feet of wooden planks, wooden floor. And so my father, and they were nailed down. So my father sawed off the nails so that you could lift that, but it would appear, the nail heads would be still there, so it would appear as if it was nailed down. and then he dug out the earth underneath there. And we would sit, so the three of us could sit there, my father and my mother with our knees up and me sitting in my mother's lap. And the one time that the Germans searched the farm, we were there for a couple of hours, you know, afraid to breathe, afraid to cough, afraid to make a noise. And it was very scary. And we were fortunate. One of our cousins, they were hiding out on a farm also. They wound up in Canada. And they had a little baby girl. And she started crying, and the father put his hand over her mouth so to stop the crying. And by the time the Germans left, the baby was dead. And he was never the same. He was never able to keep a job or function. He was in a permanent state of depression for the rest of his life. They did have two children after the war, but he was not a functioning human being, and nobody should have to go through something like that. It's the most horrible thing I could imagine.
Do you know his name?
His last name was Fried, also, like ours. Her name was Manya, and I'm trying to remember his name. Maybe it will come back to me later.
Right. When you were in the root cellar, did those windows that you described open?
No.
No. So there was really no air coming in.
No air coming in, and while we're there, my parents taught me how to read, and they taught me how to read from the one book that the farmers had in the house, which was Quo Vadis by Sienkiewicz, the great Polish writer, and also the Sunday school lessons, pamphlets that the farmers' kids, who are now grown, had got when they went to Sunday school. And you could, reading those pamphlets, you could see why anti-Semitism was so strong in Poland. The church left no doubt, and just to tell you one of those stories, and this is what you teach kids in Sunday school. Little Stanislav was playing on the street, and he saw that there was a ice cream vendor that with his push cart that came on the street, and he so wanted one of those ice creams, but he knew his parents didn't have too much money, so he didn't want to ask them. And then his mother called out to him. She says, "Stashek," that's short for Stanislav. "Stashek, I need some tea. Here's some money. Go buy tea." And that's when the devil spoke into poor little Stashek's ear. He said, "You know, Mom always buys her tea from the Polish grocer who's 5 or 6 blocks away, even though he charges more than the Jew who has a store downstairs. So if instead of buying from the Polish grocer like you're supposed to, if you buy from the Jew, you will have a zloty left over, and you can buy yourself an ice cream. Who will it hurt?" And so Stashek did that, and then when he went upstairs and gave the tea to his mother, she says, "Oh, Stashek, you've been such a good boy. Here is a zloty. go buy yourself an ice cream. And Stashek was so ashamed. And he promised himself that he would never listen to the devil and buy from the Jew. So when you're taught these kinds of things in church as a little kid, it is not surprising that you grow up to be an anti-Semite.
Did you have any understanding of the feelings of the non-Jews in your community?
Not at that, not, before we went to the ghetto. I was too young, and I never had to deal with it. Now, after the war, I did.
Okay.
But at the time, I learned about anti-Semitism from these Sunday school lessons, and my parents' stories about how anti-Semitic Poles were, and how the only way to deal with them is if they attacked you, you just don't fight back. Just curl up and wait till they get tired. Now, that left me with a lot of anger after the war.
Yeah. How long were you in the root cellar?
3 years. We were there for 3 years. And my saving grace was the occasional book my mother was able to smuggle in for me. And that involves another one of her things she did to survive. We were afraid to tell, my parents were afraid to tell the farmer, even though he was a reasonably nice guy. His wife was a bit of a dragon. So they told them that we didn't have money with us. We buried it. And so every month my mother would go out at night and risk being caught by the Germans, wander around for a couple of hours, and then come back and give them the money. And this was really dangerous because it wasn't just the Germans. One time she got attacked by a bunch of teenage hoodlums who tried to rape her, and the only thing that saved her is one of her old customers was walking his dog, saw what they were trying to do, and chased him away. But as the war progressed, my parents were afraid we'd run out of money. And so my mother came up with an idea. She knew a woman, a Polish woman in town, who they had money, and she was also very vain. And my mother tried to play on both of those things. So one night she knocked on their door and said, I came to see you because I think we could strike a deal. She said, we Jews are all filthy rich. Contrary to the fact that most Jews in Poland were poor, that myth was very helpful. She said, we just were millionaires. We had a gazillion dollars, but we were stupid. Instead of keeping liquid, we bought jewels and gold, and so all our money is buried, and it's not liquid. How can we, convert all that to money? So I'd like to make a deal with you. I will give you 20% of that money after the war if you can give us monthly money to pay our farmer. She didn't tell us who the farmer is. And so they said, they wanted more than 20%. And So she bargained with them and finally gave in and said, okay, we'll just split it 50-50. You're taking advantage of me because I have no choice. Well, if she's bargaining, then it must be real. And so they kept us, supplied us with money, and my mother occasionally, on a monthly visit, got the woman to give her a book for me. And those books were really lifesavers for me. And I was very careful to read no more than 10 pages at a time so it would last. But even when the book was finished, I could make up adventures in the kind of world that the book talked about. So it allowed me to break out of the cellar and, in my mind, wander around all over in this magical world of books. And that's why when I tell people I want to be a writer since I was 6 years old, they find it hard to believe because most kids want to be a cowboy or a sports star or something, but I did not have a normal background, and I had to wait till I was in my 70s to start writing. But that's what I always wanted to do.
After your period in the root cellar, how did you get out, or where did you go?
Oh, well, that is a complex story in its own right. The war was coming close to an end, and the partisans were really giving the Germans more trouble. And so the Germans were doing a lot more of raiding of homes and farms looking for the partisans. And so the farmers who were hiding us out said, look, we don't want to take a risk anymore. You got to go. And my mother negotiated with them for 48 hours. My father and I would stay there, and she would go try to find a new place. But there were a lot of patrol, there were curfews all over the place, and she wasn't able to come back. So my father and I got separated from her, and we were thrown out by them. And I thought it was great. You know, I was about 7 years old at the time, and being able to be out of the cellar, out in fresh air, I thought it was the most marvelous thing. I mean, I could walk, but I didn't learn how to run till way after the war. I just wasn't used to moving fast. And so we didn't know where to go. I wanted to go hide in the forest with the partisans. I thought that would be the great adventure. My father knew better, and he saw this old farmer. We're walking through a field, and he, who had been an old customer, he talked to him. This guy was a widower, and he agreed to hide us in the back room of his farm. So instead of being in the cellar, we're now in a room. You know, it was kitchen, living room, a back room which had been a bedroom. He slept in another room to the side. And we stayed there for about 2 months. What decided my dad to that this was too dangerous was an incident that shows you how nanoseconds make a difference between when you survive and when you die. One Sunday, we're sitting there in the room. Again, there was nothing to do. You just sat there, but at least there was a lot of light. 2 trucks of German soldiers arrived in the yard. And there's no way for us to escape because there's only one door and leads into the living room. And we heard them stomping in the house. The farmer, this was Sunday, he was taking a nap in the living room on the couch. And they were stomping through the house, and suddenly we see the doorknob turn. And there was a German soldier who was going to get into the room, and once he opened the door, it would be, we were dead. And then there was a yell from the backyard, and you could see the doorknob turning back, and he went out. And what happened is they weren't looking for Jews, they weren't looking for partisans. The farmer's son ran an illegal vodka still in the barn, and they had heard about it. They were here to confiscate it, and the nanosecond before the guy opened the door, he heard a yell. They had found it still in the barn, and so he didn't look any further. So after that, my father decided maybe we should try to find my mom. And so he went to the people, the Zarembas, who had been giving us money. He assumed that my mother had gone to them when, she had to leave the farm, and that they might know where my mother was. And in fact, they did. They had a aunt and uncle who had a farm 50 or 60 miles away, who were getting quite old and feeble, and they didn't want to leave the farm, but they couldn't take care of it by themselves. So they arranged for my mom to go stay there, and she worked the farm, and in return, they kept it. And that farm was very isolated. And so when my father contacted them, they contacted the aunt and uncle, and the aunt came. She really didn't want to take us and my father and I, but had become very dependent on my mom. So she came down by train, and my father spoke Polish with a Yiddish accent, and so he was supposed to be a shell-shocked soldier from the war, and he was he couldn't speak, and he wasn't quite old there. And me, I was very pale because I hadn't been outside for years, and then I had the black Jewish curls, so they put a hat on me, and we got on the train, and they told everybody my father was a shell-shocked idiot, and I had tuberculosis, and they were taking me to the country. Now, in those days, tuberculosis was like a death sentence. So everybody just moved away, and we got to the farm, and that, I've always described that was the happiest day of my life, being back with my mom. I hadn't allowed myself to think that I was missing her. And the next 6 months we were on that farm, and there's plenty of fresh food. I'll never forget that evening. We had bacon and eggs, forget about being kosher. We had milk. I slept on a bed with freshly ironed sheets, and I could smell the pine trees outside. There was a pine forest around, and that was heaven. To this day, this pine scent is my favorite smell. It's the one that makes me feel happy. And we stayed on that farm for 6 months, roughly, till we were liberated by the Germans. I would go out with 100 goats and a dog. I was a goat herd for those 6 months. It was just wonderful. I was out in the open. There was plenty of food. My mom was there. We did have one just before the war ended. German soldiers occupied the farm. They were retreating, and they bivouacked and occupied the farm and, made it their own. And one of them fell badly in love with my mom. And so he or she had to pretend to be friendly, but she told him she was a widow, and she thought, yes, he was a very nice man, but she wasn't ready to commit to another man. He wanted her to go to Germany and wait for the war to end with his parents. And I thought of my poor dad. He had to sit in the back room. He couldn't say anything. And my mother was out taking a walk with a German soldier. I was an officer. And it didn't help it, couldn't have helped his mental state.
Did you have a relationship with a German soldier also?
He tried. I wanted him dead. He already saw me as his stepson. And he tried to be very nice to me. But by then, I knew what they did. And I just hoped to get killed. When they left, we were left on the farm, and the farm was strategically located between two major roads, a railroad and a bridge. And so we were in the center of the battle between the Russians and the Germans. So the farmer and my father dug a big hole, cut down a few trees and put them across the hole, and then put earth on top of that. And we went in there, bullets were flying everywhere and shells were flying everywhere. And we stayed in there. And then after 3 days, in the middle of the night, the farm dog was with us. He started barking. And suddenly soldiers with guns started yelling, "Come out." Fortunately, it was Russian. And they took us back to, they were a patrol that was a scouting patrol looking to find out where the German positions were. But they took us back to the Russian encampment, and for the first time, we didn't have to worry about that any mistake could lead to death.
This was your parents and yourself.
Yes.
What happened to the farmer and his wife?
They stayed. They didn't want to leave their farm. They were afraid that people would come and steal their possessions. And they weren't afraid of being caught by the Germans, so they stayed behind.
Did you ever hear or see them again?
No, we did not. We did not. My mother kept in touch with the Pashniks, the people who hit us out the first time around. But no, we didn't. Although they were very nice. They were very nice people, much nicer than the Pashniks.
Okay, so now you're in the Russian encampment.
Yes.
And where did you go from there?
Well, we heard that Volen had been liberated. And we were about 40, 50 miles from there. So we, the Russians were they fed us the potatoes and tea and bread, which is what they lived on. Unlike the American Army, which you have 9,000 fighting men per division and 9,000 men in support. So we started walking. The problem I had is my mother, before we left the ghetto, bought clothes that were for me that were too big. And so I grew into them. But the shoes, I had no shoes. So I had to walk barefoot the 40, 50 miles back to Volen.
What year was this?
This would have been probably 45 or 44.
Okay, so you were 8 years old?
8 years old, yeah.
Okay. All right, so you walked back home.
We walked back home, and my parents tried to reestablish life. The people had occupied our store and building, the apartment, were really pissed because they thought, this was theirs. There was nothing for us, for my parents to buy or sell. Do you want to hear about my mother's criminal endeavors? Well, my mother had lost all respect for the law. The law hadn't, for people to say, now you got to play by the rules, from her point of view, was bullshit. So the town was occupied by Russian Kalmuks. They're from one of the Asian Russian republics. Very uneducated. But what their idea of heaven would be to get a watch, because that was a sign of culture. And they didn't know that from their point of view, bigger is always better. So my mother came up with an idea. She bought some, those three-legged alarm clock, with a bell on top. Well, she bought several of them and put watch bands on them, and she traded them to them for. There were lots of shortages. Well, first of all, she traded one for a bottle of vodka and a truck, and then there were lots of things that were shortages, and there were shortages of, and she would trade them, these watches, these alarm clocks, for whatever list of goods, and they foraged for them. How they got them, she didn't want to know. She almost got killed as a result of this, because the first watch alarm clock she sold, the Russian soldier came back and wanted to shoot her. You sold me a broken watch. So she gave him a few glasses of vodka and said, why do you mean broken watch? He said, look, the needles don't move, it doesn't tick. So she taught him how to wind it and how to set the time. And after that, she was a heroine. Everybody in the regiment wanted one of those magic watches. And so she became a black market. Whatever people needed, she could supply, because she would get the Russians to get it for her from wherever. There was one incident that was really bizarre. again on the theory that bigger is better, one day 2 soldiers came dragging a grandfather clock. And they said, we'd like you to cut it up into smaller watches. Because from their mind, this is how you do things. And she said, well, I can't do that. So they said, oh, you trying to cheat us? We've been dragging this. So she gave them some vodka. That always helped the conversation. And she says, you're right. There is a way of cutting it up into many smaller watches. But I don't know. You need a real expert to do it. I don't know how to do it. So she gave them fake address in Warsaw. She says, when you get to Warsaw, this is the address, and tell them I sent you, and he will do it for you. And so we stayed in that town for a few months. My parents, the people in town were not thrilled to have us back. My parents tried to send me to school. I went one day to school. At recess, the kids beat the crap out of me while the teacher stood there and watched. I was very angry that we didn't fight back when the Germans, we knew they were going to kill us. Why didn't we fight back? Why were we passive? So I refused to, just lay down, and I fought them, but there were too many of them, and I had no skills. So the education there stopped after this half a day. And then the people in town, we heard were going to have a pogrom and kill us. Fortunately, the commander of the Russian forces in town was a Jew, and we spent the night in the barracks with a guard, and then we took a truck and we went to Warsaw, where my mother became now a full-time smuggler in black, not just in goods, but also in foreign currency. And my parents tried to send me to school again. And this time I lasted a full day. The kids waited till school ended to beat me up, and I spent 3 days in bed. And so my parents thought that, I needed to be around kids. Anyway, that's the version that was their rationale. A few years later, I remember myself having therapy and crying, promising to be good if they didn't send me away. But they sent me to an orphanage where I stayed for 6 months. And it was really a very, very nice orphanage, except I was the only non-orphan in the place.
And where was it located?
In Zatrzebie. It was in Poland, and it was, I think, set up by either Hayes. And as a matter of fact, this is the ridiculous part of it. And this is why the picture of me as a little boy is the only picture I have. Harry Schwartz, who was the head of Hayes, was doing a tour of Eastern Europe, looking at orphanages that they had set up. And so he came to our orphanage, and he had a photographer with him, and he wanted a picture to send back of the great man with a little orphan. And I was the youngest and the most waif-like looking, so they took a picture of me with him. And I got the picture about 40 years later, because, in a very sad way, my mother, when we came to New York eventually, became very friendly with a guy who was a photographer, a young man who was a photographer. They became very close friends. And when she died, he came out to Tucson to her funeral. And at the funeral, he says to me, "You know, I have the picture of you with Harry Schwartz." I said, "Could you please give me a copy of it?" And he sent it to me. In the meantime, my parents got arrested for smuggling, and the black market. And they were thrown in jail, and they were out on bail, but they decided they had to leave Poland because if they got to court, they'd be thrown in jail permanently. So they decided to leave Poland, and in the meantime, they sent me to another orphanage in Lodz. And this was a group of kids who were they wound up on the Exodus. They were going to go to Israel. And so we were taught how to speak Hebrew, how to sing Hatikva. And the plan was my parents would leave, would escape from Poland, and eventually would be reunited in Israel. To my great relief, they changed their mind, and after about 2 or 3 weeks in the orphanage, I rejoined them in Katowice, and with false papers, we got to Czechoslovakia, where we stayed in a displaced people camp.
Do you remember the name of the camp?
I'm going to pause 1 second, and we're speaking whenever you're ready.
Okay. I don't think I ever learned the name of the camp. It was outside of Prague. It was basically a barren piece of ground with barracks. And we were in these barracks. They had triple-decker beds with a toilet at one end for the women and at the other end for the men. So there was, I think, like 1 shower and 4 toilet seats and 4 sinks. And we were there for probably a month to 6 weeks.
Can I ask you just quickly?
Yeah.
Did your parents go to Lodz to pick you up?
Yes. They went to Lodz. They picked me up.
It's a big trip.
And took me to Katowice, where they got fake papers to go to Czechoslovakia. And then when we were in Czechoslovakia, outside of Prague, somebody sent a fake telegram to the French embassy in Prague to give out 5,000 visas to Polish Jews to go to France. And so, like I like to tell, the next morning there were 5,000 Francophiles waiting in line for visas, and we got on the train to Paris. And then when we got to Paris, we threw away the visas because they were fake and declared ourselves political refugees. Hayes set us up in a hooker hotel. That's the only place that was available. I loved the ladies. They were great. And so we lived in Paris in a 1 room, half the size of this. The bathroom was a 2-stepper bathroom down the hall. Once a week we went to the public baths. My parents again decided that they were trying to find their way, get settled. So they sent me to a French Jewish orphanage, which is where I learned how to speak French. I was there about maybe 3, 4 months, and I got typhoid fever. And they rushed me to the hospital, and I spent about 3 weeks in the hospital, first getting over the high temperature you get with typhoid, and then recovering. And after that, my parents decided that it was time to bring me home. So the three of us lived in this room, and that's where my mother learned art. My mother learned how to finish men's suits, and my father learned how to make handbags. And I finally got to go to school. I was almost 11 at the time, and my mother was still working on the black market, the Rue de Rosier in the Marais, which everybody called a Pletzel. The place was where you could, there was a black market in foreign currency, and my mother was very involved with that while she was also working, finishing suits. And eventually my parents figured out, my dad was very smart. So very quickly he learned not only how to make bags, but how to design them on his own. And so in this room, half the size of this, where we lived, my parents bought 2 sewing machines and hired some people, and they started manufacturing handbags in that place. So it was a factory by day. Our living quarters at night. I slept on there was a bed for my parents. There was a cot under the bed, and we pulled that out, and I slept on that. The dining room table was a place where they cut the material into the shape, and it was. We stayed there for 2 years, and then my parents did much better, and actually bought an apartment where they could have a much larger handbag factory. In the meantime, I didn't know that I had only one shot at education. I took the exams for the lycée, and since I was already a little older, if I didn't pass that exam, my education would have been finished. Fortunately, I felt no pressure. I passed the exam with flying colors. I was put in a special class where we were taught. It was an experimental class for the bright kids. And I would have done. I was very happy that lycée. It was a collège Turgot, but my parents wanted me to go to a better school, so they moved me to one of the 4 grand lycées in Paris, the Lycée Charlemagne, where I was the only Jew and the only kid of blue-collar parents. And anti-Semitism, even among some of the faculty, was very strong. And I rebelled. I was always in trouble. And it was lucky that we moved to the United States, because I was on the verge of being kicked out. I just was not prepared to take crap from anybody. It was my reaction to us allowing to be slaughtered. And the people who protest about Gaza don't understand that the Israelis are the children and grandchildren of survivors. And the motto, never again, is very strong there. That nobody's going to kill us without us fighting back. And so when 10/7 occurred, I wanted to go kill somebody, even though at this age I've learned to tamp down some of that anger. So while I got good grades, I was a behavior problem. And we waited until eventually we got a visa to the United States.
Do you know who sponsored you?
Oh, yeah. My father had two older brothers who came here in 1912, A.B. and Jake, who came here in 1912 and 1914. And my mother had three sisters. No, he had two brothers in New York and a sister in California. And she's the one who sponsored us. She had done very, very well in this country. My mother had two sisters, one of whom who came over because their father didn't have money for a dowry, so there was no hope of them getting married, and they came to the United States where you didn't need a dowry to get married. One of them did get married. The other one wound up in a mental institution. Spent, there were all sorts of rumors about why she wound up in a mental, but nobody ever talked about it. And she died soon after we came to the United States.
Okay, so now you've got your visa to come to America.
Yeah.
And can you describe the trip?
The trip, we went on the SS Washington, which was a converted troop ship. And again, it had a bipolar population. Half of the people on the boat embarked in Hamburg, and they were German. Half of the people embarked in Le Havre, and they were predominantly Jewish. And the Germans tried to really push us around. There was a lot of, Hitler didn't finish the job, but we will. And we finally, there were too many of us for them to be able to completely put, so we sort of stayed on separate decks. Because we're coming on cheaply in whatever the lowest class was, my father and I were had beds, bunk beds, in a room with 6 other people. My mother had bunk beds in a room with six other women. But other than the unpleasant interaction with the Germans, we had it was very, very exciting. Once we got over seasickness, which was a trip and a half, but it's the arrival in New York that was really ironic. When we were hiding out, I had all these fantasies that when we're liberated, who knew how many of us were alive? People would, have a parade for us, take us on a plane, fly us to America. Well, when we arrived in New York, there was a band there. And it was an Oompa band organized by the Bund the German Bund in New York to welcome the German immigrants. So it's not us who are being welcomed, it was the German immigrants who had tried to torment us on the boat.
It was probably it might have been the first time Germans were arriving in New York after the war. Because they would have had a hard time getting a visa.
Yeah, although the German quarter was better than the Polish quarter. We had to wait for the Polish quarter. And that's what took us almost 6 years.
Okay, so when you arrived in New York, where did you live?
We came, the plan was for us to go to California. My mother had gotten pregnant just before we left Paris. And we stayed, the plan was that we're going to go to Los Angeles, where my dad's sister and her children were living. So we stayed with my uncle Aby and his wife Gucha, who unfortunately, Gussie, who had lost her son, had gotten killed in the invasion of Normandy. And she had never been right till after that. So my mother being pregnant and she mourning her child had to be just very, very difficult on her. So my mother, the idea was, had my mother gone out to California, I would have been a 6-foot-tall blonde surfer dude. But my dad is the one who went. It was his sister. My mother was pregnant, and this was a terrible mistake. My dad was never an adventurous man. And he went out there, and he just couldn't get California. He thought this place was, it wasn't a normal place. Plus, his sister said, I'll set you up. I'll buy a bowling alley, and you can manage it. And my father said, what kind of an idiot would pay money to throw a ball at a bunch of pins? You know, proof that this was all crazy. And so he made a terrible mistake. He came back. He said, we can't go to California. My aunt couldn't, you know, it was one thing to keep us for a few weeks until we went to California. To have us stay with them beyond that was unacceptable. So we rented an apartment, one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. And that's, my brother was born, we got here July 23rd, 1951. My brother was born on December 6th. My mother was not, had to take care of the baby. She didn't have, she couldn't maneuver her usual self. She made up for it, but at that time, my father had trouble keeping a job. Because he was 51. He knew how to be a shopkeeper. He knew how to be a factory owner. He did not know how to be a worker for somebody else. So he basically begged, prayed that he would get 20 weeks of work in a year so he could collect unemployment. I went to high school, but I started working nights at a candy store. I'd work from 6 to 10, and then I quit that job and became first an usher and then a relief manager for a chain of movie theaters. And that lasted through, and there I worked from 6 to 12 of most days. Thursdays I worked from 12 to 12, and I worked Saturday afternoons and Sunday afternoons. I did that through high school and college.
Which high school did you go to?
I went to DeWitt Clinton High School because that's where my aunt's son had gone to. My brother went, who was born here, went to Bronx High School of Science, which always reminded me was a much better school, and he's right. DeWitt Clinton at the time was sort of like the blackboard jungle. There were 3 of us in my homeroom who wound up going to college out of 35, and we raised the grade average for a homeroom to maybe 35 or 40. Mm-hmm. I was fortunate that because my English was very rudimentary. I'd taken 3 years of English at the lycée, and when we stayed at my aunt, I tried to acquire more vocabulary by translating the only book they had, the Pickwick Papers. I sat there, and things like spats and andiron aren't useful, and on top of that, the words that were useful, I didn't know how to pronounce right. So it got a lot of laughter. But they put me in remedial English with the football team. We had a very good football team. And so their grades had to be kept up by being put in dummy classes. And they became my protectors. So it was fine. And the faculty soon figured out that I knew far more, and they would tell me, can you pass this Regents exam? And because I was so far advanced because of the lycée, I did, and I graduated in 2 years. Fortunately, City College of New York was free, so I went to CCNY, and eventually when I finished there, I went to NYU to get my PhD in chemistry. I came to Philadelphia because when I was finishing my PhD, my advisor said, "Well, you can go take a job," and I got a job teaching at Hunter College in New York. And one of my students had a cousin who was at a medical school, Hahnemann Medical School here in Philadelphia, and he kept raving to him about what a good teacher I was. And so they recruited me after 1 year at Hunter. They wanted to establish a PhD program, but it was the worst. The good part of it is that brought me to Philadelphia, which I love. The bad thing was they had no clue what to do with me. My specialty wasn't what they were interested in. They wanted me to do research, but had no money to do research. And so I started looking for teaching jobs. I wanted to go back to New York, and I had trouble getting a teaching job. So I went to, I decided to take a job in industry because I couldn't stand it there for a year while I looked for another teaching job. And DuPont hired me, and I was surprised because they didn't hire Jews. I knew that because when they came to interview at NYU, they didn't hire the smartest guys who were named Schwartz and Goldberg. They hired a guy named George Vermont, whose real name was George Heimowitz, but they didn't know that. But they offered me a job, and I was very fortunate that the first project they gave me turned out to be way bigger success than they expected. But I became a chemist because my parents told me a man's destiny is to earn a paycheck and support a family. And they had never had a Luftmensch in the family, so they were not about to accept the idea of my studying writing. And so I started as an engineering student, found out I was totally unfit to be an engineer, but I had a lot of chemistry classes, so the simplest thing was to switch to chemistry. I turned out to be good at it, but it was something that I really didn't value. And so I went back to school and was still working for them and got a second doctorate in social psychology. And left DuPont and went to teach organizational behavior at Rutgers. But I was starting at the bottom again with 4 kids. And the way to support the family was to do a lot of consulting. And then I was never home. So I went back to DuPont. And because at least there I could keep normal hours. And I retired from there when I was 63. And my friends at the University of Pennsylvania said, come on, why don't you join us? And I went more because I get to hang out with friends rather than because I loved chemistry. But at 75, I said, that's enough, and then I retired and started writing.
Can you tell me your children's names?
Yes. I had 4 children, now I have 3. My oldest daughter is Lisa, who I named her after my father's youngest sister, who was his favorite, Lycha. My son is Mark, and unfortunately he was killed while they were on vacation. The car was hit by a drunk driver, and he and his wife were both killed. And he was named after my maternal grandfather, Mendel. Those were my 2 children from my first marriage. My 2 children were Susan, the older one, who lives in Philadelphia. I finally got a chance to call Rachel after my grandmother. I couldn't name Lisa Rachel because my first wife's middle name was Rachel. And my youngest, her name is Sarah, but everybody calls her Hallie, was named after my mother's older sister, Sarah.
The world is changing. How do you think you've reacted to October 7th from a survivor's point of view, not just an American point of view?
Well, like I said before, it was a gut punch. It was a reminder of what had happened. It may have been on a smaller scale, but was again people just indiscriminately killing men, women, children, raping, maiming. I was just filled with an incredible rage about it. And I'm used to anti-Semitism on the right. I had a lot of frustration from anti-Semitism on the left. Young men and women who would not, if they had to live under Hamas, they would have revolted. But it was, it's this thing, they view Israel as white and Western. They view Palestinians as brown and third world. And the reaction is, this is a white Western people oppressing brown third world people. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm either happy with Netanyahu or the settlers. I think they're beyond the pale. There will be no peace unless there is two-state solution. And the settlers, and what happens is what we may wind up getting with Trump. You have a coalition of ultranationalists and religious fanatics. And those are not people who are willing to live with others. It's got to be, they believe God mandated that they are right. Okay? So I am horrified at what happened on 10/7. I am pissed beyond belief at the young people who picket and sit on the campuses. I don't see them in front of the Russian embassy. Ukraine did not kill Russians, and there were far more Ukrainians being killed by the Russians. I don't see them protesting that. So I just see it as and it's fed by subtle anti-Semitism. There's always been an intellectual anti-Semitism on the left, which was not as overt as on the right. It was more intellectual. And it's that which has come out from under the intellectual guise. And to have groups, Queers for Palestine, I would like to see how long they would survive under Hamas. So you have rage and anger and disappointment, and at the same time, the recognition that this is not being helped by a right-wing, ultra-religious government led by the Israeli Trump.
Tell me about your religious feelings as you grow older.
Well, part of the Jewish tradition is we expect God to be as just as he expects us to be. And as a result, while I'm intensely Jewish, I am not that terribly religious. Okay? Part of it because I've viewed the Torah as an oral translation of a tribe. It is not, every word is not directly from God's mouth. And so much is tied up in nitpickiness. Okay? God does not have time to worry about whether we eat a ham sandwich. Okay? And he's got a lot to answer for himself. He promised Abraham that he would protect his descendants. Where the fuck was he?
Do you believe in God?
It's a very complex thing. I don't believe the Big Bang Theory is the answer. Okay? What was there before the Big Bang? I was trained as a scientist. Faith demands suspension of disbelief. So I would not say I don't know if there's a God, but I don't know that there is no God. But the God of our ancestors failed us. And at the very least, if he exists, I'm seriously pissed with him. He broke his covenant with us. You know, if he's got time to worry about what we eat, when, why doesn't he have the time to worry about the terrible things that happen to us? If there's something, if there's time for him to intervene, this was it. So, like I said, my feelings about religion and God are very, very complex, and they're filled with a mixture of, I don't know if he's there, but if he's there, he's got a lot to answer for.
Is there anything we didn't talk about today that you want to make sure that we don't miss?
I think, and I think you've said it to me before, people who survived, like my parents, and especially my mother, were changed by the war. They had to make decisions and moral choices that nobody should have to make. People don't, I was fortunate. I was young when it happened, so the impact on me was not as great.
Different.
Okay? But when I think of the impact on adults who had to go through it, and what they had to do, I've often thought, if I was an adult at that time, would I be able to save my children? And that's always on my mind. I wish I could say yes, but the strength that it took to survive, is
Unbelievable.
yeah. It's this is the thing that people forget. I try to tell my children, who found my parents very difficult, and they were difficult. But I wanted them to know there's a reason why they were. And that's part of the reason I wrote the memoir, which is, people always say, there isn't that much about you in there. I said, yes, because in a play you have a star and you have a supporting cast. And clearly, my mother was the star, and therefore she got all the attention, and deservedly so.
Anything else you'd like to add today?
No, I think that's it. I hope it was worth doing for you, not for me. For me, clearly it was.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
3, 2,
Can you please tell us who is in this picture?
Okay. This is a picture of small part of my father's family. On the right is my paternal grandfather, Moshe Fried, and he, from what I understand, was a real tyrant. The world revolved around him. And next to him is my dad when he's 5 years old, before he was sent off to study to become a rabbi. Next to my father is one of his older sisters. I think her name is Blimcha. She was divorced and was living with my grandparents with her children. And to the left is my wonderful grandmother, Rachel. She was married at 14 to my grandfather, who was then 15. They shaved her head, put on a shadel on her. She was a mother by 15 and a grandmother by 31. And she had, but she was an extremely tough, sturdy woman, and just a very, my memory of her last time I saw her was 3, but she was one of the really sweet people.
Who is this?
This is, again, my grandma, my father's mother, Grandma Rachel. This was taken from the picture you saw before. She must have been around 55 at the time. She was 50 when my father was born. She had 17 pregnancies, but only 11 of the children lived. There wasn't much to do on the farm. No TV, no radio.
Who's in the picture, please?
Okay, these two pictures are pictures of my parents, which were taken maybe 2 or 3 years after the war. They took those pictures, I think, for passport pictures. You know, it's funny. I just getting teary-eyed looking at my mom at that in those years. They were. My mom at the time probably was. Nobody knows for sure because she thought truth was a plastic medium, and so nobody knew exactly when she was born. There were always arguments. I've settled for 1914, so she was probably about 36, 37 at the time. And my dad, on the left is my dad. Depending upon who we listened to, he was either 10, according to her, 14 years older, according to him, 10 years older than her. I think if I had to believe somebody, it would be my dad. But it really doesn't matter. But these were soon after the war.
explain to me why you believe your dad more than your mother.
Well, my mother thought that the truth was whatever was convenient and necessary. And I knew this forever. I remember there were times when we were in Paris, and since they had both were now employed, the JDC stopped giving them money, and my mother thought this was just unacceptable. So with holding me by the hand, she went to their offices, looked around, found the one unmarried guy who didn't have a wedding ring on and was reasonably unattractive, burst into tears and told him, you know, you look like the sort of man that can understand, is sympathetic. I am just a poor widow with my poor orphan child, and they've cut off my money. How could they possibly do? Can you please help me? And I'm standing there squirming because I know, of course, none of it is true. But she was in tears, and that couldn't stop, and so she kept getting not only the usual supply of money and food supplements, she got more than her share. And this was just typical behavior on her part. So it's my dad, on the other hand, was just the average human being. I'm sure he sometimes told a lie. As a matter of fact, when I caught him in one when I was 12, my world shook, because he was my one source of what I believed was truth. But with my mom, to the day she died, I knew whatever was convenient.
Thank you.
This is me at age 8 in my first orphanage at Zatshebia. This is taken from a picture with me with Harry Schwartz, the head of Hayes, and God, I have big ears. And it's the only picture I have of me as a child. And I'm very grateful to have that.
Please tell us what we see here.
Yeah, this is the front page of the memoir that I wrote called My Mother's War, because it is her story, and it has her at the center, as she would have liked to be and where she belongs, and me below, and because a large part of it is written from a child's perspective. And above you have the German troops marching. I've just finished a novel which you as a writer, you should never waste a good character. And my mother was a great character, so I wrote a novel about a fictitious character who grows up like she did, and follows, and her life through and after the war. But because she has no child and no husband, they don't survive the war. I can, I can invent whatever I want, and even though sons don't believe that their mother ever have sex. I even allowed her to have sex 3 or 4 times. And it's been word of mouth.
Can you tell us who's in this picture, please?
Yeah, this picture is of my family. We, during a vacation in Maine, there is me and my wife and our 4 kids. My son Mark, my oldest daughter Lisa, and my daughter Rachel, and at the bottom, our daughter Hallie. She's named Hallie because while her name was Sarah, my sister-in-law, Susan's sister, had a girl named Sarah also 6 months before her. And she was bitching about that we were stealing her name. So we said, okay, Linda, we'll call her Sally. And Rachel, who was 19 months old, couldn't say Sally, so she pronounced it Hallie, and the name has stuck, and this is her sort of official name. When she was in school, the teachers would say, Sarah Fried. She says, no, Hallie Fried.
Thank you.